First, by Professor Stephen DeGiulio, Professor of English, Dona Ana Community College, New Mexico State University. His paper is titled Power and Aesthetics, Rabindranath Tagore's Decolonizing Pedagogy. This would be followed by Professor Ashwini Kumar's paper, Awareness as Meditative Inquiry, Broadening and Deepening the Concept of Awareness in Educational Theory. Professor Ashwini Kumar is with the Faculty of Education, Mount St. Vincent University, Canada. This session would be chaired by Dr. Indrani Bhattacharjee.
Can you hear me okay with this? There we go. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank everyone who's organized this. They're tired of being thanked, but it's a wonderful program, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to attempt to present a pedagogy which is almost unknown, unfortunately. Everyone in India knows the name of Rabindranath. But in the schools of education, he's really forgotten already. And even though I'm not any kind of expert, I'm going to attempt to convince you that we need to learn from Rabindranath, and we can solve a lot of the problems of schools by taking his example. But I'm not going to give you any information this morning, and that's part of the presentation. Most of what happens in schools has to do with information, with epistemology. And Rabindranath's pedagogy is like a three-legged stool, and epistemology or knowledge is only one of them. So please, if you don't mind, put aside your pencils and notebooks and turn off the screens and just accompany me on a little bit of an excursion this morning. I don't think you'll need to take any notes. Note-taking is good when you read. That's what scholars and students do. Reading and then writing and then reading and then writing. But you can't listen when you're also writing. I have some artwork that's going to accompany me. And let me just start by trying to explain the three legs of the stool. If epistemology is one of them, the other one is just being, which Rabindranath approached through his art, and which our schools overlook to a great extent. And the other one is power relations. How does one spouse have power over another, and the reverse? Power relations between family members, in the classroom between teacher and students, between students and students, and of course power relations, the influence of the state, religious and political ideologies, ethnic knowledge bases, etc., etc. So I'm going to come on in, there's room for everyone. The artwork that you see, some of you may know very well, some of you may not. Rabindranath felt that his message was so much linked with Bengali culture and language that he despaired that anyone outside would be able to appreciate very much of it. So when he was, I guess in his 60s, he started doing paintings which don't require language. So the paintings you'll see have no titles and no explanation, but I hope they give you a sense of a synthetic approach to learning and pedagogy. There are places up front. Okay. Maybe I'll try. Is this one also turned on? Okay, well, or maybe this one is better. Let's start with a short mental experiment. And by the way, for the newcomers, I have asked you to please put away your pens and notebooks and so on and just be here for the duration. That's part of the presentation. Thank you. let me turn you into extraterrestrial aliens. And you're flying through this part of the universe, and you see this planet, and you want to find out what's going on. So you have very sophisticated scopes, and just take a look anywhere on Earth. You can zoom in and zoom out, and just tell me what you see going on this planet now. You can just call out.
Great deal of conflict, bloodshed, ethnocentrism, mutual aid.
Okay.
Traffic moving around.
Traffic, sometimes jammed up also. What else?
Agriculture.
Sorry?
Agriculture.
What kind of agriculture?
Crops.
Crops growing. What else?
Dolphins.
Sorry? Dolphins. There are a few left, yes.
Potential Prime Minister having a chair on deck.
Okay. Let's skip the political references for today. Thank you. Yes.
Sir, I have focused on Bangalore and I've been seeing the very interesting listening to you.
Okay, thank you. Take your scope and look around. What do you see? Excuse me?
Sea.
Ocean, the ocean. Unfortunately, the ocean doesn't have many fish in it anymore.
Daughters of plastic.
It has tons of plastic and is filling up with jellyfish. There's an interesting book called Stung, if you're interested in marine biology. Okay.
I think thousands of children getting impatient and ready to leave the morning school.
Now, this is the first mention of children. Why didn't any of you see children anywhere? The reason is they are sequestered. They're totally separate from adult life. They're boxed. And I think you're right, some of them would like to get out of those boxes, but they're in chairs and they're in classrooms, boxes within boxes. They're in school buildings. Why? Why don't they participate? We see adults doing things like you've said, which lead us to conclude that the world is full of adults who are idiots. I mean, conflict, war, destruction, all the things that you have said. Now, have you ever observed little children? Think of what Krishnamurti says when he talks about observation. You fully, seriously look without preconceived ideas. What's the nature of children? What do you see when you see young children? Tell me. Play, happiness, innocence, inquisitive, trust, energy. Do all of these things add up to learning? You could say children are learning systems. Biologically, that's what children do. They learn, they experiment constantly. And yet we have a situation here where we sequester children and we prevent them from learning. And the result is that we have a planet swarming with idiots. And I hope you're not offended when I use that word. I'm using it in a philosophically grounded way to mean people that have no understanding how the world works. They don't know who makes the decisions. They don't know what happens. They don't know where the things come from that they use every day. And yet so many of them have degrees and education, and they read books. Something is wrong with this picture. Right? And what I hope you leave with today is an idea that Rabindranath has really understood a lot more than our professors of education. No offense, some of you are sitting in here, I know, right? Few artists in any medium or epoch have portrayed the hearts and minds of children as Rabindranath Tagore has. You don't mind if I sit down, I hope. In stories, poems, plays, and songs, the heart of his visionary decolonizing pedagogy is respect and love for the child's spirit, robust, free, adventurous, eager to learn with or without company, but at the same time, vulnerable. Rabindranath recognizes learners and teachers as unique beings who need to create their own learning paths while freeing themselves from coloniality. Coloniality. I don't know if you use that term. I'm going to read a short quotation from Krishnamurti, which has to do with this, and try and develop meaning around the term coloniality, which will be helpful. This is Krishnamurti. That is real education, not merely to require you to pass examinations for which you have crammed up, or to write out something which you have learnt by heart, but to help you to see the walls of this prison in which the mind is held. Society influences all of us. It constantly shapes our thinking, and this pressure of society from the outside is gradually translated as the inner. But however deeply it penetrates, it's still from the outside. And there's no such thing as the inner as long as you do not break through this conditioning. You must know that you are thinking, what you are thinking. You must be conscious of what you believe or do not believe. All this is the pattern of society, and unless you are aware of the pattern and break away from it, you're still a prisoner, though you may think you are free. Social conditioning, which is not necessarily a bad thing. All societies operate that way. Even other social species operate by the continuation and stability of society by conditioning new members, right? But coloniality is a little bit different. Coloniality adds a specificity to the concept of social conditioning. And I'm going to read a short definition by Nelson Maldonado Torres, who's a Caribbean philosopher. Coloniality is different colonialism. Colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or a people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such a nation an empire. Of course, here in India, we know a lot about this. Coloniality instead refers to patterns of power that emerged as a result of colonialism, but that define culture, labor, intersubjectivity relations, and knowledge production well beyond the strict limits of colonial administrations. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. Not it comes after, it's that part of the colonial system which doesn't need the politics of one country literally being the colonizer, right? Coloniality. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. It's maintained alive in books, in the criteria for academic performance, in cultural patterns, in common sense, in the self-image of peoples, in aspirations of self, and so many other aspects of our modern experience. In a way, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality as the time and every day. So this is the specificity of the kind of social conditioning we have, which comes from the world created by Euroman. It's a term that's ironically taken from anthropology. Ironic because anthropology for so many years was the servant of colonialism. And it's a gendered term, Euroman, who took over the world in about the 15th century. And one of the pillars, of course, of Euroman's hegemony is rape culture and subjection of women. The history is very simple. Euroman took over by enslaving his own people, making them into laborers, taking them away from their traditional ethnic lives, and then one by one took over the other countries of the world with this strange but very effective commerce, depending on slaves from Africa to be laborers, traffic in addictive substances, tobacco, alcohol, sugar, opium, and the pattern of destroying the natural world. Remove all the whales from the ocean. Of course, when the whales were gone, with no more whale oil, unfortunately they discovered petroleum. Removing the seals, killing the animals, cutting down the forests. And so when I use the term idiots in a philosophical way, these are people who are destroying the world that they live in as well as the world we live in. It's not as easy as saying there are oppressors and oppressed. Everyone is together in a kind of dead-end scenario. And if we can liberate the children from this punitive sequestration, and Rabindranath is the one who saw this. All of this was going on during his time, and he presented it in ways which were, I believe, so far ahead of his time that they didn't register very much on people in general. Individuals, of course, have had their lives changed. I found one of his poems when I was very young, and like a thunderbolt, it hit me and I memorized it. And years later I found out who this was, and I went to Shantiniketan. I had the chance to study with several people there. Unfortunately, I never learned the language, so you can help me fill in some of the gaps. Rabindranath's pedagogy is not a one-man show, but the development of an old thread in a cultural tradition that invests heavily in its children and whose key concept, arguably, is learning. He cultivated this tradition and sheltered it from colonizing pressures in the schools and university he founded and supported for 40 years. And I know if you go there now, you don't find much that's really very different or interesting, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Rabindranath was someone who constantly dealt with the people in front of him and the things that were like that. He didn't set any model. In fact, I can't recommend that you read his books about schools or children or learning because he didn't write about that. There are collections of his writings. H.P. Mukherjee, who I had the chance to know and study with in the 70s, has compiled in terms of conventional educational categories like curriculum and instruction and so on, some of the various writings of Rabindranath. One of the first world figures to understand and appreciate both Asian and European civilizations, though of course imperfectly, Rabindranath created art that was generous and loving, yet sharply critical of violent, hypocritical colonial rule, not just by the English, but also by Indians who worked with the English. And he was constantly criticized for this from every side. Nevertheless, much of his work has become part of the Bengali cultural canon, and the writing that does not lose too much in translation has entered the canon of world culture together with his paintings. If this complex man, called the myriad-minded man by his biographers, can be said to have a principal message, it's that we need to honor the valid traditions of our ancestors by transforming them into new formulations suited to our needs and our times, unceremoniously discarding what's no longer useful. He created ad hoc pedagogy for his historical moment and for particular learners and teachers, showing us a way out of the morass of contemporary schooling. Let's take a minute and let me give you a quiz, because I'm the teacher and you're the students. What are the 4 rules of school? Because one of the things that you can notice if you scope around the world is that school is the largest social institution on earth in terms of human hours. And everywhere it's almost identical. The same kind of rooms, the same kind of chairs in rows, the same kind of thing goes on, whether it's in China or Africa or South America or right here in the neighborhood. So just think of yourself as a teacher. Small children are coming into your room. What's the first rule, the first thing you say to them? Of course you say hi. Lovely children, hi, how are you this morning? But then when we get down to business, what's the first thing you say? Okay, the first thing is sit down. And one thing that Rabindranath developed clearly is the concept that schooling is actually abuse of children. It's actually violence against children, punitive violence. And many people find this a strange idea. We don't want to think about it. But if it seems exaggerated to you, please think about it. What happens when you sit down in a chair, not even on the floor? First of all, you can't breathe fully, so you're a little bit suffocated. And don't forget, they sit in chairs for how long? 20 years. 20 years, all day, hour after hour. The postural muscles are deformed, they are shortened, right? They can't no longer stand up and walk freely. They can't breathe fully. What happens to your blood, this poorly oxygenated blood, when you sit in a chair? What happens to your blood? Where does it go? It goes to your feet. And then we tell them, listen to me, remember what I say, learn something. When they have their poorly oxygenated blood pooled in their feet, they can't move, right? Now, why would we, because we tell ourselves we love our children, they're beautiful, they're cute, they're nice, and so on, they're the most important thing in our lives. How can we send them to these punitive institutions, which really do resemble prisons or factories, where they're put in a chair, where they can't breathe, where they can't move? Sit down, be quiet. Wow, be quiet. So stop expressing yourself. Sit down also means stop moving, stop being alive. This is a biological concept. Movement is life, right? Learning is part of every living thing, right? The plants move towards the light, move away. The animals are constantly in motion, constantly learning, adapting to their environment. And our own children, which we hypocritically say we value, we prevent from learning by putting them in chairs, stopping them from expressing themselves. Sit down, don't talk. Yes, sir.
Sorry for disturbing you. I think what you said is true. We see everywhere students are sitting in rows and columns. In every classroom, in every country, in every state, now we brought to our notice. But what I felt is all this is happening because what actually is happening in the classroom, I'm sorry if it hurts some people. I think what is happening in the classroom is not learning. What is happening in the classroom is teaching. And what should happen, as you said, is learning, active learning, interactive learning, experiential learning, collaborative learning, cooperative learning, participatory learning.
I'm sorry, I have to. I'm sorry, I have to cut you off there. Please let him finish. It's
Well
coming into
said.
his time.
Thank you. My mentor put his approach to pedagogy in an aphorism. He's Caleb Gattegno, one of the great pedagogues of the 20th century, and he said, the subordination of teaching to learning. Of course, it's an aphorism, we have to understand what it means, right? In relation to the rules which are in force, and people are trained to enforce those rules. Sit down means stop being alive. Sit down in chairs. Be quiet means stop expressing yourself. And what's the third rule of school? Sit down, be quiet. Listen to me. Hey, I'm the teacher. You can't listen and think at the same time, can you? You can't listen and imagine. So now we are crippling the children's thought process, getting them to stop, to inhibit their own thinking, their own creative, their own critical thinking. Sit down, be quiet, listen to me. And what's the fourth rule?
Memorize.
Well, sometimes, right? But a little more broadly than memorize. Memorize and reproduce. But in a more broad way, do what I say. No dictator has such power because they're small. What can they do? Right? And what do we train them to do? We train them to be little bureaucrats handling pieces of paper, so they'll grow up and they'll think, wow, I have my very own cubicle. Now I'm free. I can spend all day working, shuffling papers for my corporation. Right? Or if I'm very special, I can shuffle human bodies in a hospital. Right? And then I get to live in a big house. Rabindranath, of course, set up his own school and university. But that didn't resonate with colonial educators for good reason. His aim was to shelter learners and assist them on their paths toward subjectivity, agency, and the courage to fight for a life in their families and communities, and also in their own language, Adivasi languages, the NATO Indian languages, and so on. One of the first people on the world stage to understand that people have a right to live and preserve their own culture, their own languages, and just slapping on a language which is convenient for the government is another abuse of people's rights. I would like to hear from you, so I'm skipping a few pages. Right? Rabindranath's insight into childhood is part of a profound understanding of human life at all stages and of the world, cultural, and economic crisis. An understanding drawn from Indian cultures, from a wide knowledge of Western and Far Eastern traditions, and from indigenous knowledge systems. But he was not unduly impressed by the technological achievements of the West, the pragmatic genius of indigenous traditions, or elaborate Eastern philosophies. The key to his visionary pedagogy is refusal to embrace any particular tradition or ideology, but rather stay centered in the global historical moment. This is what I'm trying to stress with the concept of coloniality. It's not just there are oppressors and oppressed. There's a particular pattern of oppression which has derived from the colonial history, and that's the thing that we have to understand. We have to learn how to graduate people who have a clue about how the world works, right? I am so ashamed when I look at American textbooks. And it's not really different in other languages, but I'm American, I'm there, and I see the textbooks, especially the history textbooks. The definitive study is called Lies My Teacher Told Me. Everything your American history teacher got wrong. It's a sociological study that goes into the textbook, the contents, contrasted with what happens, and it's so shameful. Children, you feed them lies, what's going to happen, right? And some of them are nice myths. Americans are the best people, they go around the world helping everyone. You know, it would be nice. But it's the inversion of the truth which cannot be considered educative, right? I hope the situation is not so bad, but if it's not so bad here in India now, it might be moving in that direction. Treating his teachers as learners themselves, Rabindranath made growth in awareness, emotional sensitivity, intellectual depth, and creative expression superordinate to curricula and methodology. And the three legs of the stool come into play here, because the education we have is mainly concerned with epistemology, with information, right, with repetition and rote learning, and so on. And what he stressed in terms of aesthetics has nothing to do with knowledge, with facts, right? It's an emotional, the aesthetic expression, and the aesthetic experience, right? How children develop their sensitivity that they come into the world with, unless we try and stifle them. The biological function of children and youth in our social species is, through learning, to adapt to changing cultural and environmental conditions, but only if they can see and hear and know what those conditions are. When we sequester them, it doesn't really matter what we do with them. Just put them in a box and wait till they're big enough to occupy a labor, someplace in the labor force, which benefits someone else. And all that huge potential, we have, what, 7.2 billion brothers and sisters in this world? What problems could we possibly have with all that help? In effect, each child creatively reconstructs the cultures and languages of their environment. This is an idea of evolution, social evolution. The young people pick up things and introduce innovations in language in every aspect of life if they're permitted to. On the other hand, if school is putting them through cookie cutters, molding them to a certain fixed form, then we have cut off the possibility for human survival because we cannot adapt. And we're seeing this so much in such an accelerated way. The climate is changing, the political climate is changing, more wars and conflict and so on. And yet we are cutting ourselves off because our ability to adjust to things comes mainly from children and youth. They're the ones who are bright, sensitive, smart. They pick up on changing things if we let them.
Stephen, would you wrap up in 5 minutes or so?
Final paragraph. Rabindranath today. Rabindranath's approach to education is through a balance of being, power, and knowledge. The three stable legs of a stable stool. Living and learning with the whole self in relationship to others in the natural world. His genius was to apply this under the violent structure of hegemonic colonial rule and mobilize others to work for emancipation and social justice. He recognized that the cultivation of the inner life, correctly understood, is as important as mastery of the outer world. Thus, a school should provide opportunity for children to watch clouds float by, as well as create plays, paintings, publications, craft work, gardens, songs, pageants, to master languages, sciences, and mathematics through creative understanding, to strengthen one's personal weaknesses and develop one's personal strengths. The whole curriculum of the first 12 years can be learned by any child who can talk in 1 year. Think about that. It's true. In 1 year. And what can we do with the other 11 years? How many languages can they learn? How many skills can they develop? If we gave them a chance. Rabindranath never ceased to be true to his idiosyncratic nature, pouring forth a creative torrent in every artistic intellectual medium, as he fought for the rights of children to be educated in their own language, their own history, and in a manner consistent with their own way of life and inherent biological potential, rather than in a manner convenient to their colonial masters. In his words, why then doesn't he start up from his chair and dance his ideas out in the sunshine? Because he's been to school. It is at school that he has learnt the habit of stifling so thoroughly the natural companionship of body and mind. This power and freedom we have deliberately mutilated, and of both we have deprived our children. Some of you must know Tagore's very short tale called The Training of the Parrot. There should be nothing dead or inert about life in school. I would allow all our boys and girls during class to jump up, even to climb into a tree, to run off and chase after a dog or cat, or to pick some fruit off a branch. This is really why my classes were preferred, not because I was any special good as a teacher. Play is a natural learning. Animals play, young animals, right? Play is when the person is exercising their individual agency, enjoyment, all the faculties of life come into play. Subordinate teaching to learning. But the moment you leave the little fellow fallow, the utilitarians will pounce upon it and say, why leave this space unfilled? You should grow a crop there. They possess such a superstitious faith in the efficiency of their own teaching that they don't realize that periods of non-teaching, we're all teachers, maybe teacher educators, stop teaching. That periods of non-teaching are just as important as the means of tempering formal instruction. As a means of tempering formal instruction. In our schools in the States, children no longer have recess, no longer have physical education, no longer have music lessons. They are in their chairs much more than before. These past 20 years have been very unfortunate, and they're given exams over and over again, right? It's a universal pattern, unfortunately. Civilization has built up the barrier between body and mind, and it's our task to break down this gap and to open up once again the natural passageways between the two. The Greeks were probably aware of the need for this interrelation, for they cultivated a perfect harmony of body and mind. They linked teaching with music and games. I think we can go to, do we have some time for questions?
Yes. Do you want to collect them or would you answer?
It doesn't matter, one by one is okay.
Bear with me a little bit here, but I have the utmost respect for Rabindranath Tagore's pedagogies and his understanding, but every time I hear these alternative modes of education, why is it that everyone who translates either Tagore's or Krishnamurti's, you make adults into idiots and children, there's something wrong with that translation, because children are a part of the civilization and with adults, right? You can't magically create children different from the adults. So children learn with the adults, good or bad, and it's a whole process. You can't sort of abstract it out and say, this is prison, this is a children outside school too. They learn in very different ways. Part of the teacher, they might be sitting in class, the teacher might be screaming, they still might be learning with each other. I don't know why we sort of make this sort of dual thing between the adult and the child and the adult together in this whole thing. And a system has come up for many reasons. There could be good reasons for bad reasons. But I think we need to understand Tagore in a different way, not by creating this, let's change the world, we're treating children like prisoners. And I find that too stark, and I find that actually defeating.
Sorry, I didn't hear the last part.
Defeating?
Self-defeating. Okay. Thank you. Good question. There are two parts to the answer. And one is that, of course, children and adults have to come back together. And under the intense sequestration that has come to be school in our colonizing world, colonizing the children to their social roles, the parents are separated very much from the school and the children, right? In my country, parents and children have very little time together. I certainly hope it's not so bad here, right? But it's very true, parents need to be involved and not put out of the school. And it's also true that if the children are learning, the teachers have to allow them and go along with them and learn with them, right? The idea of a school as a special place that can do special things to make special children is subscribed to by people with a lot of money, and they pay a lot of money for that, and the results are nowhere anything really worthwhile, right? Gatenio said one day, someone asked him about the future, where are we going? And he said, the coming age will be a pedestrian one. It will need everyone to bring it about. And so the structure of class system and isolating people from each other, of course, is part of the problem. All we can do is what we can do as one person with the children and others we come into contact with. Thank you. Very good question.
I appreciate all of this, and I mean, as much as educating educators and researchers, we would like all of this to come in. Where do you see this stand in the contemporary times when it's so high stakes of accountability, where every time the gun is on the teacher's head or the parent's head? I mean, there's so much at stake in the school and the education system all over the world, that where do you see this standing?
There's so much at stake. Do you mean the danger is that children will fall off socially and not have a place in the society? I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
No, I meant so much at stake in so much at stake in terms of the education system, where it has become so performance-driven, it has become so market-driven, where value for every penny that is spent on the system has to be realized. I mean, these are situations across the world that our education systems have become like that. So that's where I meant high stakes.
I think this is outside of my area of competence, but I appreciate the question. When I was young, I answered that for myself in a very easy way. When I worked in a school or did some kind of job, I accepted that I may not last very long, but I was only going to do whatever made sense to me and to the children and other colleagues that I was working with. And that's what taught me how to be a teacher and how to be a teacher of teachers. And I have a long resume with many different places. I didn't last very long in some places when the culture wouldn't tolerate innovation and wouldn't tolerate that kind of thing. Another question. Thank you.
Sir, I love Tagore, and I liked your expressive presentation very much. So it's not a question, but just to show the gratitude for you, 2 lines from Tagore. Ami prithvir ko bhi jeta tar uthe dhoni, amar ganer shure shada tar jagiye tokkhani. I am the poet of this earth, and whenever the earth creates a sound, that very moment my heart spontaneously comes up with these songs. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. I had a couple of poems which I might have read. There are some good translations coming out in English. I don't read or speak Bangla. One day maybe I will. Thank you. Another question.
Hello, Professor. I am Kuldeep. Actually, it was like an intellectual treat as far as your talk is concerned, but I missed some points which I would request you to help me to understand properly. I believe that all the phrases and terms you have used, as I remember, power and aesthetics. So these 2 phrases are coming with their own history. So we couldn't understand, as far as myself is concerned, I couldn't understand what the historical baggage you are talking about and how these 2 phenomena and concept are being used in your talk. One thing. And second thing is that is it the liberty from fixed norms and physicality are you talking about as decolonizing, or decolonizing is something beyond that? It is something which makes some dent on our consciousness, and how aesthetics is producing those dents in Rabindranath Tagore's system or philosophy of education. So please shed some light on these 2 dimensions. Thank you.
I will try. Very good questions. In 30 minutes, I don't think there was much time for a very large topic. What I said at the beginning, some of you weren't here, is that I hope what you will take away from this short talk is the idea that Rabindranath still has a lot to say to us, and we have to investigate, right? Other examples and explanations, if I had 30 days and not 30 minutes, I think we could have explored that in more depth. Yes?
Stephen, I have two quick questions for you.
Yes.
One is, a lot of what you said seemed to verge on Michel Foucault. You know, if you've read Foucault's Discipline and Punish, he does argue that the school is a kind of prison, and that the teacher is a and in fact the whole system of power relations, the school resembles the prison, and it's intentionally so, because the purpose of schools and prisons is to produce docile bodies on which we can imprint, you know, societal power discourses. The second point that I want to make is, are you familiar with Martha Nussbaum's work, a recent work, not for profit, where she draws upon a variety of sources, including Tagore, to challenge some of the dogmas of neoliberal education with its parametric accountability concepts, and argues powerfully for a more holistic development model and a more holistic education model? Any comments?
No, except to say thank you. And of course, I didn't read my footnotes. Foucault is in there, and probably Martha Nussbaum also. That would be kind of another topic, but well taken. Thank you. Yes, sir. Yes.
Thank you, Stephen, for your talk. Actually, these things are very relevant for me because I teach adults philosophy and humanities, and I have tried using performative pedagogy in classroom. So we put off the chairs, people can move in the classroom, and the idea is to bring practice and body inside the classroom rather than excluding it out, and also connecting it with experience. But the most important problem that I feel is to make a case for this, because if Zen students have been already conditioned through their school life till they reach university education, and they already know only one mode of learning, and if I try to do something else, they think it's not learning, it's something else, and it's not rigorous enough or things like that. So for a lifelong learner, I feel that it's not only important for children but for adults also to have this kind of pedagogy inside the classroom. And but still this idea that we have to articulate it in a way that we make a case for it before adults start accepting it as valid forms of knowing and learning.
Let me answer that with a very short story. When I taught third grade in Calcutta, after the first 10 days, the children stood together. The boy with the best English stood up. They didn't know much English. It was supposed to be an English medium school, Julian Day School outside of Calcutta. And the spokesman said to me, "Sir, why don't you beat us?" And I said, "I don't want to beat you. Why should I beat you?" And they continued, and several of them, they pressed their case like little lawyers. They said, "How will we know what to do if you don't beat us? How will we know when something is wrong?" Now, the teachers in this school were very nice. I have no problem with them. But they had a habit of walking around with 2-3 rulers in their hand. I never saw any of them hit any of the children. I never got any indication there was any abuses. In schools, there are lots of physical and sexual abuses of children. Absolutely, that's one of the big problems. But I never saw that in the school. And after a while, you know, their argumentation was so good, I say, "Okay, I'll beat you." And for about a week, I did. I hit them left and right and center whenever they did anything. I even picked up pieces of wood and hit them. All right? Of course, I didn't hurt anyone. I did it I just played the game. And what happened was very interesting. One day, it just stopped. Because during that 10 days of beating, they were doing all the silly things, like knock someone's book on the floor, you know, elbow their friend, all of those things that go against the culture of the classroom. And eventually I understood they dropped it because I was there with things for them to learn, with interesting things for them to do. And they were so conditioned, they were so colonized, that it's a relationship like a prison guard with the prisoner. It's a conflictual relationship and a hierarchical relationship. And they liked me at the beginning because here's some strange foreigner in their classroom. It was very interesting. And it took them a little while to work out that. I had to work with them and beat them for a week and then they drop that. Okay. It's a little bit of an oblique answer. I hope that helps. And, yes, sir.
Sorry, we